everyone, and welcome to yet another interesting conversation with interesting people from software development. I'm Alex Bolboaca, and I'm coming to you from Mozaic Works studios. And my guest today is somebody who perhaps you don't know by his name, because he has created a successful alternate identity on, on the internet and even in real life. But he is a very interesting person who I've discussed a lot, especially when I've been to London. He has been running coding dojos for a number of years now. He is trained in martial arts, so we'll have a lot of things to discuss about. Welcome, Nigel, or as you are known, Sleepy Fox.
Thank you, Alex. Where would you like to start?
Well, I like usually to start from a short biography. In particular, what I'm interested in is what brought you to software development. Why is this interesting, and what have you done in software development that you find interesting?
Okay. All right. As Inigo Montoya said, let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up. I spent more than 30 years in the software industry. I've done pretty much everything, from repairing broken joystick adapters to designing a system to securely store and distribute the entire nation's lifetime healthcare records. From plugging in patch cables and server racks to being a CTO, from debugging PLSQL in guilt settlements to building a simulation of the global movie box office. I've been a developer, a systems analyst, a DB admin, a sysadmin, a systems architect, a solutions architect, a product manager, a project manager, a portfolio manager, a CTO, a business consultant, an agile coach, and at the moment I'm a principal engineer. I've probably done a few other things as well, but I'm forgetting. I've done a lot of things, and it turns out that people say, "How do you know so much?" And a bit like Michelangelo, asked about his artwork. Although, of course, I'm nowhere near as good an artist as Michelangelo. Maybe that wasn't such a good analogy after all. He said, you would not consider my art so great if you had realized how long it took me to get here, which is pretty much how I feel about my career. I might know a lot, but when you've been in IT over 30 years, it's just a process of accretion. Stuff sticks.
So how did you start? What was your first programming language and some of the first projects that you
My first programming language was Commodore Basic. The school that I was at bought one computer. And there was a session every morning break and every lunchtime throughout the week where you could book 10 minutes on the computer. And yeah, there's not a lot, as it turns out, that you can do in 10 minutes on a computer, especially not like a Commodore PET, which was an 8-bit micro using a 6502 processor running at, I think, 1 megahertz and had like 16K of RAM, I think. And a cassette drive to store programs on. So I guess that was kind of the start. It seems really bizarre looking back on it. I mean, why would I have found that interesting? I don't know. I guess it was new, it was different, it was strange. It was unlike anything else. It wasn't part of the curriculum. I mean, nobody knew how to teach computing in those days. I'm not even sure how the school managed to get a computer or why. It was certainly before computers were considered at all useful, like the schools, certainly not secondary schools. I don't know. I just became hooked on it, and I guess some number of months, somewhere between 6 months and a year later, I managed to convince my family to buy me a Commodore VIC-20, and that was really the start of the end. Late nights spent in front of the TV, like typing in programs from Computer and Video Games magazine into the computer, and then inevitably, like many hours spent debugging the programs that you just typed in, because you typed them in wrongly, or because there were typographical errors in the magazine where the listing was. Yeah, so that was kind of how I got started.
Yeah, I
guess I
remember.
was 13, maybe.
I remember those days in Romania. We had clones of ZX Spectrum, and they were built
There were
in Romania.
clones.
Clones, yes, because
Wow.
it was communist Romania, so they were built in Romania as a clone. Because ZX Spectrum, it was an open architecture, so you could copy it fundamentally, as far as I remember. And so we had a bunch of clones, and it was really funny that first I had BASIC, but then BASIC was not enough anymore, so I had to switch to assembly. And one of the problems with assembly is that if you did something wrong, the whole computer would reset and you would lose the program. So that means the cost
not even
of failure,
a blue screen.
Yeah,
it's just a black screen.
Yeah, and the cost of failure is high. You couldn't save it fundamentally. You had to retype it.
Yeah, it didn't stop us failing though.
Yes. So, and what was your first or some of the first professional projects? So projects for which you actually got paid to do?
So depends on how you consider getting paid. So I worked as a teaching assistant in the parallel computing lab at Leicester University when I was doing my PGD, postgraduate diploma. Because I didn't do computer science at university. I did physics with astrophysics, which seemed like a terribly good idea at the time. Hint, actually, not so much. And so after I graduated from physics with astrophysics and discovered that actually there were no jobs for astrophysicists, and I didn't really want to go on and do a PhD in astrophysics, so I did a conversion course into IT. And as part of that, I got paid for being a teaching assistant. And because I'd already done that particular course as an elective in the previous year, the last year of my BTEC, last year of my BSc. But then at some point you got involved with the business of software. Yeah, so I grew up in Sussex, so I went back to Sussex. I lived in Chichester, which is an old like Roman town, later medieval market town, still sort of like, you know, small rural town in the middle of nowhere. Needless to say, there wasn't any jobs there for either astrophysicists or computer scientists. There was a small shop above a wine merchant's in the South Street of Chichester, because Chichester only has basically 4 streets: South Street, North Street, East Street, and West Street. There was a small shop there called QD Computers, who did lots of various different things to do with the Acorn Archimedes computer, which was like one of the first 16-bit computers of its time. And they needed like a general dog's body to help out, and so I did like all kinds of random stuff, like repairing broken joystick adapters, as it happens. So yes, I definitely learnt my way around a soldering iron. I think that's a good experience for anybody in software as well. You started when the way I met you was actually through your coding dojos in the London community, but I don't. Yeah, precisely. But I don't actually know how they started or when. So I guess that's there's a little bit of a story around that. So I've lived in London since the early 90s. I didn't really get involved in like meetups, partly because meetups weren't really a thing, and partly because I wasn't really a joiner. That became more of a thing, at least certainly for me, around kind of the mid 2000s. I discovered Skills Matter, which was just awesome. I spent a lot of time there and at Extreme Tuesday Club. And I guess, you know, gradually meetups sort of started to become more of a thing. And it was in 2011 that I started the London Code Dojo. I was working for a small consultancy called Source Sense. We're an open source consultancy, and so we worked with lots of different open source products, mostly Apache products, and we were an Atlassian Platinum partner, which means that we did a lot of consulting work around Atlassian products, even though they weren't open source. Not quite sure how that came to be, but it was a thing. Anyway, so being quite prominent in the open source community, we'd been running code dojos internally for a while, and my boss said, well, why don't we open this up to the public? And I was like, yeah, obvious, really, you know. Obviously the wheel should be round, you know. Don't know why it took us a million years to invent it. So yeah, we did. I think the first time that we did that, I think we scheduled it for something like 6:30, and you know we got like 2 or 3 pizzas, and it came round. Pizzas arrived, and it got to like 6:30, and there was just myself and 2 of the people there from work, and we were like, well, you know. Yeah, we have pizza. Life's good. We'll carry on anyway. You know, maybe someone will turn up. You know, it takes time to get across London. London's a big place. And so kind of we started on a coding cafe and eating pizza and drinking beer, and then the doorbell rang, and there was a person. It's like, wow, we have one person. Awesome. Welcome. Come in. Join us. And then later, I think we had 3. I can't remember whether it was 3 or 4 people joined us that first evening. I think it was 3. And yeah, and it just went on from there. We ran code dojos every month for a long time. At one point, we were working our way through 7 languages in 7 weeks, and we did a normal code dojo every month and a 7 languages in 7 weeks dojo every 2 weeks. So we're actually doing 3 dojos a month at that point. The meetup group, despite the fact that we haven't really done anything since COVID, has more than 1,700 developers on it. I, over the years, run code dojos at Facebook. I've run code dojos at eBay. Just loads of different places have donated their office space, pizza and beer, to the London Code Dojo to run stuff. Yeah.
So what made you start doing Coding Dojo? And actually, before that, perhaps it's important to explain what a Coding Dojo is, because not everybody in the audience will know what it is.
And not everybody, and other people have been doing Code Dojos as well. I didn't invent it. Although I didn't copy anyone either. I think there's an element of kind of parallel evolution. So what is a coding dojo? A coding dojo, from my point of view, or at least the coding dojos that I run, it's a safe space where professional developers can come together to learn, to try new things, to grow, to practice skills, to meet new people and discover new ways of doing things that aren't part of their normal day-to-day working experience. For some people, it's an opportunity to learn and practice XP skills, TDD, pair programming, refactoring, simple design, that perhaps they don't have the chance to at work. Now, obviously, as time goes on, this becomes less and less of a big thing. I mean, back when I started, there were perhaps the majority of organizations, 70 to 80% of organizations, hadn't even heard of extreme programming. And even the idea of pair programming was like this weirdo thing that like some people in the US perhaps did, but really no sane project team anywhere would consider doing, because obviously it was half as efficient as any other form of programming. So just having a space where you could just try stuff out that wasn't constrained by the day-to-day pressures of your working environment was quite a valuable thing. So yes, XP, TDD, pair programming, simple design, refactoring, working on code katas. We use the Pomodoro technique. So we present the problems we solve, people pair up depending on which language they want to use, and whether they've got experience of TDD or not. We try not to pair two people who don't know TDD, because obviously that's going to be a bit of a blind leading the blind. It helps if you have someone who's done it before. We work in Pomodoros, 25 minutes, 5-minute plus break. We do perhaps 4 Pomodoros. And then we all come together for a kind of a retrospective where people display their code and their tests up on the projector, on the big screen, walk through as a pair what they did, the design decisions they took, why they did it this way, would they do it the same way again? Was it a good decision, bad decision? And solicit constructive feedback from the group about how their code could be improved. Perhaps a better way of approaching the problem if they were to do it over. Or conversations around design decisions. And how things have changed. Because obviously when you're displaying your code and tests on the screen, what you're seeing is the end product of a couple of hours of code and evolution. And perhaps it didn't start out that way. Perhaps it went down one route and ended up like being a dead end and taking a different route. So interesting conversations. And then we finish up for the evening, and those people who have a bit of time on their hands and want to go down the pub for a drink and to continue talking about techie things, then that's what we did. So that was kind of the Code Dojo.
So what made you start organizing coding dojos?
I guess so. Obviously, like code kata, code dojo, right? The language comes from martial arts. I'd been studying martial arts for many years, and because my prime interest was Aikido, in Aikido there is no solo work. There's no, well, people say there are no kata in Aikido. It's not quite true, but it is mostly true. The vast majority of practice is pair programming, but like with people instead of computers. It's all partner work. And a dojo is a special place. It's a place where you come together to learn. It's a place where you come together as equals. It doesn't matter who you are, like in your working life. or your community life, when you enter the dojo, you're a student. And the purpose of being there is to learn and to help others learn. Particularly for Aikido, unlike any kind of sport martial art, there's no element of competition. So it's not about showing how good you are or how you can beat up some bozos with a flying roundhouse kick. It's instead the focus is quite different, and that affected me when I first started. And I felt, I guess, that it would be, and I guess there's also an element of kind of post hoc rationalization here, because memory is a fallible thing, but I suppose I had this idea that the dojo was a great place. I'd got so much from it. It felt like there were a lot of similarities between Aikido and programming. And I know for a fact, having been on the Aikido mailing list for many years, that I wasn't the only programmer that practiced Aikido. This was quite, this was not an uncommon observation. And I guess it just seemed like the natural thing to do. Especially, of course, if you've watched The Matrix, right? The dojo is an artificial environment that is like The Matrix, where you can try stuff out. It has the same rules, like air and gravity. Some rules can be bent, some can be broken.
Yeah.
So it's a place to test yourself.
But do you find that many programmers appreciate this kind of test? Because it is one thing that I notice with many people is their first encounter with feedback is very difficult.
Yeah, most of us, I would say. I certainly include myself in that. I don't know. So I'm trying to. I guess that's possibly true of the Code Dojo as well. So if you've ever studied martial arts, and I'm speaking here not just to you, but like to the audience as a whole, anyone who studied martial arts knows that the retention rate for people is really, really low. Like more than half of the people who walk in through the door of your dojo, training hall, quoon, whatever, after the first lesson, they won't be back. More than half. Probably more than 90% won't stick it out for 6 months. By the time you get to 6 months, there's, I don't know, you've got maybe 1 in 10, maybe 1 in 20. So there's, and I think you're right. I think part of it is to do with feedback, because when you're thinking about things, when you kind of imagine yourself performing martial arts, that kind of imaginary the conceptual gap there between the way that you imagine yourself performing and the way that you actually perform on the mat as a beginner especially is huge. And I guess it's tough to recognize that, actually it's not as easy as it looks. And if you want to become good at this, then there's a long, hard road ahead. You're going to have to put in a lot of hard work. So I suspect that it's obvious, or perhaps more obvious in a dojo, in a martial arts dojo, in an Aikido dojo or a karate dojo, the dropout rate. I guess perhaps from a meetup, it's less obvious because you're not expecting the same people to come along every meetup. It was, I mean, with the London Code Dojo, I mean, I've met a lot of people from there, who I would count as friends, who have come back irregularly, but again and again and again over the years. And yet, a lot of people, I guess, will have come once and then never come back. But I don't really notice those because, unlike a martial arts dojo, you expect the same people like every week. And if they're not there, then, they're not paying their membership fees, they're not signing in, and, you know that they're not turning up. With a code dojo or any other form of meetup, you're not expecting the same people to come in one time after another. You're expecting it to vary, and thus there's no real mindfulness of those people that are regularly turning up, other than the ones that you just recognize and you learn their name, and now you know a bit about them, and you went down the pub with them afterwards, and they have a dog called Harris. And when you get to know people, like they're individuals now, and they're not data points. So the kind of how can you measure, like, okay, how many people I know versus how many people turned up? So I don't know. Maybe it's about the same. Maybe 90% of the people who come along are gone after a couple of tries. I don't know. There's 1,700 members, and a meetup typically has 20 to 30 people. So by force of numbers alone, right? That's probably the case. You don't have so much of a retention problem in IT because we pay people to be there, right? If I paid people to be at the Code Dojo, then I suspect retention wouldn't be such a problem.
Yeah, so it's interesting for me because when I attended your dojo, I was coming from my experience as facilitating code retreats, which was another similar but different type of event. So I knew a lot about the facilitation and the stuff that goes on, but I still felt very welcome there, and I felt a lot like learning and experimenting. It was a really, really nice experience. Well, yeah,
I've worked hard to make it that way.
Yeah, and I could see that there was a community there. So there were many people who actually knew. So you did before the sound you do when you start the dojo, which the audience won't know, but many people.
The start of every Pomodoro starts with Hajime!
Yeah.
Which means begin in Japanese, and it's something any karateka will be familiar with.
And I noticed that some of the people were already saying it before you did. So, so that showed that they were there again and again and again. It wasn't their first time. So it was very, very fun. One thing that I'm wondering, though, thinking about what code retreats and coding dojos attempt to do, it seems to me, as an outsider, I've never done martial arts, but as an outsider to martial arts, it seems to me that the churn in martial arts is on purpose. It's more likely you want to preserve kind of the best, the people who can stick to the discipline, and more, or at least that was the initial intent. Whereas with these events, we are trying to perhaps to get to as many developers as possible. And it seems to me there's a tension here, but perhaps I don't understand martial arts. So
I can't speak for all martial arts. So in respect to the Code Dojo, I've worked very hard to make it an inclusive environment. And literally, provided that you can code, you're welcome. Full stop. That isn't really different from my experience of martial arts. Now, admittedly, Aikido perhaps isn't necessarily representative. The founder of Aikido had a very spiritual focus. and liked to see Aikido as a mechanism for uniting the world in harmony, which sounds a bit strange for a martial art, for the purpose of a martial art. So possibly, right, not representative, but I haven't just studied Aikido. When I went to London, so I first started in Aikido when I was back in Sussex after I graduated from university. That was in, look at my notes, 1991. I trained for perhaps 2.5 years before moving to London, and then I would come back and train at weekends, and I would be looking for somewhere to train in London on a regular basis. And so I visited a lot of dojos, and I trained with a lot of different teachers in a lot of different arts. So I trained in Shuindo Musuraya Judo, Saitai Iaido, Chen Pai Chi and Yichuan, Wing Tsun, Sistema, Arnis, Eskrima, and a bunch of other stuff. I started by visiting every single Aikido dojo in London that I could find, and none of them were doing something that was the same as what I had been studying, which came as a surprise to me. But I learned yes, one art has many styles, and so I started looking around for traditional Japanese martial arts which were related to Aikido. And then after I'd worked my way through like half a dozen or more of those, I just wanted somewhere good to train. And I eventually settled with studying the old Yang style Tai Chi under Paul Breacher, which I studied for many years, which again has a very similar kind of philosophical bent and training style to the Aikido that I was familiar with. And I continued training with Mike Hurley in Chichester over the years. And I still train with him, or at least I did up until COVID. So back to the point. All pretty much, and I'm just whenever I say all, I always think, actually, do I really mean all? Are there some is there an edge case there that negates this? I cannot think of a dojo, and I must have trained in 30, 40 dojos, queens, training halls, whatever they call themselves, across London in those early years. I cannot think of a single place where I was not made to feel welcome, where I was viewed as, some kind of stupid outsider. Oh no, we're not going to bother with you. Oh, you studied Aikido. Well, that's not a real martial art. It really wasn't like that. And I don't know, maybe there are some training halls in some places where they are like that. I don't know. I never came across them.
All right.
So I don't think the purposes are that different, really. Not at least in my experience.
Right, but then what is the big challenge for continuing to do the martial arts, similar to continuing to come to the dojo? You think it's about the disciplines, it's about the feedback, it's about maintaining a level of discipline?
I don't know. People talk about discipline. I'm not sure that isn't a red herring. I think I watched a video at one point years back by one of the British Olympic cycling team, and they were making a point, and the point, well, they probably made lots of points, but only one really stuck with me, and that one was, if you're not suffering, you're not improving. And you can imagine like someone cycling through the rain uphill with a headwind, like in freezing conditions in winter, like trying to maintain a pace, and you're like, oh well, yeah, obviously they're suffering, but can you suffer in a code dojo? And I think you can. I think when you're outside your comfort zone, when you're no longer comfortable, when you're doing something that you don't know how to do, that you're not an expert in, that isn't part of your day-to-day experience, I think you do get uncomfortable, and you are, in a sense, perhaps, to use the exercise metaphor, suffering. And I think people have to want that. They have to want to improve enough to work through that pain.
Yeah, I mean, this is very similar to what I've seen in code retreats, because I've seen people coming again and again at code retreats and improving and trying out new things. But I've also seen people who couldn't see the point of trying out different things, or coding out the same problem in different ways, or even pair programming. Why would I once had a guy who was very upset because he was a Ruby programmer, but he ended up pair programming with a C++ programmer, and it was, why would I do such thing on myself? C++, maybe it's interesting for 45 minutes. It's not so hard.
Yeah, it's only 45 minutes after all.
Yeah.
A different experience. So you know Samir, don't you?
Who?
Maybe Samir Talwar?
Yes, sure.
Yes. Okay, I thought you did. So I was running a code dojo, and we were having the retrospective piece at the end. And after people had showed their code and test and walked through their solutions and talked about their various solutions and things, I asked people if they had any feedback about the session itself. Was there anything that you liked? Was there anything that was surprising? Was there anything that needed to be improved? Just general feedback. And one person said that really they didn't think the session was very valuable because they didn't really learn anything. They didn't learn anything new. And I paused for a moment in order to collect my thoughts and make a diplomatic response. And Samir piped up, well, that's entirely your own fault then, isn't it? Because you should have pushed yourself. You should have tried something new. Yeah. This is an environment in which you can try new stuff, not be spoon-fed it. And God bless him, he was absolutely right. Thankfully, he said it, because I couldn't have said that, because being the person running the session. But yeah, you're there at your own behest. You're there for yourself, for your own improvement. And yeah, we have to work for it.
Yeah. This actually maps one of my experiences where I wasn't such a diplomat. I was running a code retreat, and there was one guy who was doing Python. I tell this story in the book of Code Retreat, and also I told it multiple times, but it's still interesting. And after every session, he would tell me Python is the best language. This was his only takeaway after the retrospective. And at the end, we do a final retrospective, and I ask him, okay, so what was the thing that you learned today? I ask everybody, and he's like, I didn't learn anything. And so my answer was, okay, so why did you stay? Nobody was forcing you. Yeah, it's all right. So we have these types of practice sessions that have come up, and they seem to have come up from martial arts, like code katas, coding dojos. There's also like smaller koans, coding koans. And they map the way we learn martial arts, but to programming disciplines. And still, one of the questions that I ponder about is, does this way of learning actually work for the disciplines required in programming? I mean, a lot of things in martial arts, again, as an outsider, I see that a lot of thing is discovery. You are discovering how to do things. Isn't it better to be taught in programming?
I think that we are taught in a code dojo. It's just the teacher might not be the person facilitating the session. When I first started running code dojos, I kind of did very much kind of put myself in the role of a teacher. It was like, here was a bunch of people, most probably didn't have very much experience with the XP programming disciplines and practices, and so there was an element of just teaching people how to get started with this, teaching people what they were doing wrong, the right way of doing things. Over the years, I moved more into a coaching role and less of a teaching role. And I think part of that has to do with just the fact that XP practices are more familiar to people these days. But I think part of it is also because I think it's a more powerful learning experience for people to discover things themselves, or for things to be revealed by the people they're working with, rather than to have like the sage on the stage tell them something. And so even when I look at someone's code and I want to say, look, that's just wrong. You don't need to use a factory pattern there. Instead, I will ask them a question. I see you've used a factory pattern there. What made you choose this approach? And engage them in a dialogue. What I want is for them to make the realization themselves that, hey, I've introduced extra complexity here where I don't need it. There might be a simpler way of doing this, for instance. Because if they realize it themselves, they own that. It's their discovery. If I tell them it, they don't own it.
So this is very common, and there's actually an art to it, right? Because it's very easy to go into suggesting things without realizing, and it's easy to be annoying when you ask such questions. Do you ever get people annoyed when you ask them what made you do this decision?
Thankfully, not often. But I do think this is kind of similar to, again, my experience of traditional Japanese martial arts. Tamura Sensei would say, I will not teach, you must steal my technique. Meaning that he would demonstrate something, but you had to figure it out for yourselves how he was making it work. You could see what was being done, and if you were lucky, you got to be uki. So he would do the technique to you, and you would feel it, which makes a huge, huge difference. There's a lot that you can tell that you cannot necessarily see that's going on. Once you've seen it, or even better, felt it, then you can try and replicate it with a partner and figure out, okay, how exactly did they make this work? And once you've figured it out for yourself, then it's your technique. You've stolen it, as he says.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think this makes a lot of sense, but it's also perhaps it's interesting when you have the realization and when you actually learn the learning sticks much better, it's yours, and so on. But it's hard to get to that point. It's harder than reading a book, for example, or then.
Yeah.
So then, do you think that coaching is very important in these situations?
I guess I feel so. Yes. I do think one of the nicest things about Code Dojos is watching the interactions between people, and in a group of say 20 people, and having a pair demonstrating their code and talking about the decisions they made, and then having other people ask them questions. Pardon me, and having other people suggest, "Oh, would you consider doing it like this? How do you feel about that? Do you think you could clear this up? I think this would be a better name for this. What do you think?" And yeah, there's something fulfilling about that, about watching a community become self-sustaining, about the group being able to drive its own improvement rather than you continually needing to kind of poke and prod.
Yeah, and this is a lesson we learned as well in code retreats. We need to extract ourselves as much as possible from the learning and be more like guiding, creating the right environment, fundamentally.
Yep. I'm just wondering whether I can spot it on my bookshelf. There's a book called Teaching from the Back of the Room.
Yes. Yeah.
Which definitely influenced my facilitation style.
All right. So to change a bit the topic, you mentioned in the beginning the Extreme Tuesday Club, which is an interesting part of the software development in London. It's actually one of the meetups I've never attended yet. I really want to at some point.
It's virtual now, so
yeah, so
you have no excuse.
Yeah, it's easier. And one thing I'm interested in is, of course, it's about extreme programming, as far as I can tell. What made you want to learn more about extreme programming?
I read Kent's book, Extreme Programming Explained, and it would have been, I don't know, maybe 2002, 2003 that I read the book. I was involved as a software development methodologist, which primarily in those sort of around sort of 99, early 2000s meant RUP. So I was a RUP consultant. Yes, we like to say that we were doing Agile before it was called Agile. Although if you've ever done RUP, you'll know that the vast majority of RUP implementations look absolutely nothing like Agile.
Yeah, and just to clarify, this is rational unified process.
Unified process, yes. Yeah. Although to be fair, that's somewhat less to do with the rational unified process and mostly due to the way that people implemented it. So I was always absolutely fascinated by anything in the software development methodology space. So once I became aware of the book, I immediately bought it, read it, and thought, wow, that's interesting. There's some cool stuff in there. Of course, there's some absolutely ludicrously stupid stuff in there, like test-driven development. How can you possibly write a test when you don't have any code yet? Obviously that bit's rubbish, but there's some other good stuff in here. And so started down the road of investigating that and integrating that into my practice, and then integrating that into. I was working for a company called Open Methods at the time, and they were, as I said, a RUP consultancy, but they were working on their own kind of meta methodology called Open Path, which was basically a catalog of methodological components, with the idea being that you would create a methodology for every specific project that you were involved in by selecting various different components from methodologies and then blending them together into a synergistic whole, which was a fantastic idea. although there was only one small problem. It turns out that that's incredibly simple to say, but actually very difficult to do.
I imagine it's also quite difficult to sell.
Yes. Although, to be fair, Open Methods always said that the only customers they ever got were burn victims.
Okay.
Were people who had tried to implement RUP before and got burned, and then went, oh, okay, maybe we need to pay some expensive consultants to help us. Now that we've wasted hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds trying to do some kind of organization-wide RUP transformation.
So what made you start thinking that TDD was actually a decent idea?
Nah, it's a crap idea. I still don't think it's a good idea. I actually doing it, really. It's, for me at least, it was something that I had to experience. And I'm just trying to think back to, like, the early days of XTC and my early days of XTC, because XTC was around for years before, like, I came on board. I think it started in like 2000, and it is as far as I'm aware the longest running agile or even maybe IT meetup in London.
Mm.
I'm not quite sure whether it was the influence of people at XTC, and I don't think it was, because I think I was already practicing, even if badly, by the time that I came along to XTC. So and admittedly I can't remember, so I'm guessing here. I think it was just actually trying it.
Mm.
Maybe I felt something along the lines of, well, Kent's obviously written a whole bunch of good stuff. Perhaps he isn't completely wrong about this. Maybe give it a try and see what happens. And for some things, you need to spend quite a bit of time doing them before you become convinced that actually this is better than the previous way that you did it. And I've had plenty of experiences like that, but TDD wasn't one of them. TDD was one of those things that once I'd started, it was just like a bing, light bulb. Aha! And from that point on, I was sold.
So it probably also helped people starting with TDD, either in coding dojos or in other types of settings. But how did they approach this? Was it hard for them? Did they have a similar experience with you, or you noticed other ways of other reactions to the method?
So the vast majority of people who I've either introduced TDD to inadvertently through a coding dojo, or when I've run some kind of corporate training and actually been involved in teaching TDD, I think a lot of people are dubious about it. But it's, if someone comes along to a dojo, they try stuff out, they're like, and then they go away, and you probably don't see them for at least a month, like until the next coding dojo. But likely they probably don't even come to that one, right? They might be along in 3, 4, 5, 6 months' time, perhaps. So, you just don't hold that state in your head. So you never really don't know. When you run corporate training, you're typically there for a few days. And generally most employees, kind of the way they work in their reaction to corporate training is, this is what can I use as an analogy? This is like going to school, right? I didn't sign up for this. I don't want to do it, but I have to do it. So yeah, might as well make the best of it. And you spend like perhaps at most 3 days with a group of people. Usually it's only a day or two, and then you're gone, and you probably won't see them again unless they happen to pop along to a code dojo or some other. You see them at some other meetup. So it's really difficult to tell. The only times kind of when I have a sense of kind of the longitudinal progression of someone's thinking patterns is when I'm actually working with a client for a long period of time, when I'm embedded within a team or teams and I'm working with them. And probably more than half of the time, they've already been exposed to TDD by the time I get there. So I'm not like I'm not their first experience of TDD.
Yeah. So
that's actually a really difficult one to answer.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries. It actually shows because, as you said, TDD is something that might take some time to get into, and 3 days is often not enough to actually get into it. It's just enough to get the basics fundamentally.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also enough difference in the way that different people approach TDD to mean that you can experience TDD in one training session or in one code dojo or in one pairing session with a coworker, and you just experience one facet of it, one way of doing it in one particular environment with one particular person, and that might not gel with you. You might not like it. But our natural human reaction, of course, is to throw like that label on the entire bucket of TDD and assume that all TDD is like that, which obviously it isn't. I was doing a training session at the International Road Transport Union in Geneva, and when I started the session, it was like we were like an hour into like a week of like training sessions and practice stuff and embedding with teams and stuff, and the group said, "Do you teach the London style of TDD?" And I was like, "What? I mean, like I come from London. I'm not quite sure what you mean by the London style." And after a little bit of talking, it came out that what they actually meant was the top-down mockist approach that Steve Freeman and Nat Price popularized through growing object-oriented software through tests, as opposed to the Chicago school or bottom-up of like just write small things and compose them together. So yes. That was I at that point I didn't even know they had names.
Yeah, and it's even worse than that because I think Adi, my brother, did some experimentation and identified at least 15 different types. So there's a lot to explore here.
Totally believe it. Right?
Yeah.
There's if you get they used to say that if you get 10 different methodologists into a room, you'll find 11 different ways of doing something.
Of course. I like to switch now to another topic because you've been involved in a number of interesting projects. And one thing that's interesting to me and to our audience is what challenges have you faced in these projects? So I know you have some interesting stories about the projects you've been into. And perhaps you can find one or two to share.
NDAs are obviously problematical. So I guess it's long enough ago that I can talk about the National Programme for IT, Britain's £22 billion white elephant project to try and revitalize the nation's healthcare infrastructure, or healthcare IT infrastructure. That was an enormous project, disaster. Up until comparatively recently, that was the world's largest IT disaster project, or at least the ones that had public figures attached to it. Maybe there were larger ones. A few years back, it emerged that the F-35 avionics program actually was more of a financial disaster than the National Program for IT. So now it's the second largest disastrous IT project that I'm aware of. So what can I tell you about that? There were 6 different organizations, big consulting organizations: BT Syntegra, Fujitsu, CSC, IBM, and a couple of others around the country, being paid enormous amounts of money to develop or partner with IT systems providers to create some kind of global solution, or at least national solution, for primary, secondary, and tertiary healthcare. So hospitals, GPs, pharmacies, mental health care trusts, all of it, the whole thing. This was obviously a hugely ambitious project. And I think that was the first time when I realized I was working for BT Syntegra at the beginning of that project, and I found out that the size of the London local service provider part of that project with BT was, at the point of the signing of the contract originally, I think, and I can't quite remember exactly what the figures were, but I think it was £1.89 billion. Now, I'd worked for like investment banks before, so I'd been involved with big IT projects. But you know, when you have like £1 billion like sticker on your project, that's things. It warps your perceptions. It you know, things are different. Things are on a whole new scale. If you've got an IT project that's like £100,000, if someone asks you to bend the rules, someone asks you to do something that might not be unethical, but might be just a little bit dodgy, you're just going to say no. If the project that you're working on is worth like $10 million, maybe you're not going to say the same thing. If you're a principled person, of course, like I am, then of course you will say no. But there are many people for whom a 20, 30, 40, $50 million project is enough for them to, if not necessarily break the rules, then certainly creatively bend them in order to get things done. When your project is larger than $1 billion, then yes, Dr. Evil appears, and people suddenly start doing things that you just would not even consider. And I think that was an eye-opener for me. When there's that much money floating about, it's not an IT project anymore. It's politics.
Yeah. So I can imagine that we haven't had this scale of projects in Romania, but there are some IT projects that were obvious, corrupted and so on, and always due to money, of course. Well, what I found interesting about this in particular is that I was working on a healthcare project as well, only from a GP perspective and for another country, so I knew a lot of the things going behind, and it's a very complex domain, right? It's a domain, and as far as I understand, part of the problem with the British approach was that they couldn't get the GPs on board with the changes they were actually trying to make.
It wasn't just the GPs. They couldn't really get anyone on board. It was a real struggle. Part of this was political, because Connecting for Health, which was the chunk of the NHS that was responsible for implementing the whole project and all of its various IT systems, that part of the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, has no reporting lines into any of the primary or secondary healthcare trusts, the GPs, the hospitals, the mental health units, the pharmacies. They had absolutely no control. So they could say, hey, we've got this great new system. Do you want to use it? Go on. You know you want to. Give it a try. And a hospital that employs thousands of people, that has literally a matter of life and death IT systems in operation every day, is like, you want us to replace all of our IT systems with a new IT system, which we are unaware of and haven't even looked at. And we have hundreds of terminals and thousands of users and hundreds of thousands of patient records, and you want us to just change all of that. And the risk, the enormous risk there, is such that the administrators and consultants who are in positions of power are just like, no, why would we want to do that? That's risky. That might affect the care that we offer to our patients. That is unacceptable. So it was quite literally the case that Connecting for Health could not even give away those systems to hospitals and GPs and pharmacies. It was straight from the starting lines. It was doomed to fail. There was a similar system that was created by Logica, much smaller scale, for the armed forces, the combined armed forces in the UK, the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, to provide a longitudinal healthcare record for soldiers. They built the whole system and deployed and trained all of the staff in its use for, I think, £20 million. So that's 3 orders of magnitude less. And part of the reason that they were able to do that is because there was a chain of command. People at the top said, we're going to give you a new IT system. And the army and other armed forces, doctors and nurses went, sir, yes, sir! And that was it. Make it happen. So they did. I don't think you can do that with a distributed autonomous power structure like the NHS.
Yeah, and with such complexities involved, because again, it's about having reliable systems that can communicate and that are easy to use by GPs who have perhaps 5 minutes at the end of their appointment to fill in all the necessary data and so on and so forth. So
we already know that, we knew this back when we started the project, that the systems that GPs used were so, for want of a better term, user unfriendly, that they spent more time operating their terminal than they did talking to the patient. And I mean, the last time I went to the doctors was, thankfully, touch wood, a few years ago. But even then, even just a couple of years ago, it was like my doctor spent more time staring at the screen, like, you know, tabbing between fields and typing stuff in, than it did actually looking at me and making eye contact and asking questions and seeing how I was as a patient. And that's not good. You know, we don't want to be building systems like these. We want to be building systems that help doctors and all other professionals do their job more effectively, not that distract them from doing a good job.
Yeah, and that's why one of the things I think I learned as a programmer even is that it's very useful to know, first of all, what business you're in, because that influences a lot of things. And second of all, your users, or at least have an idea about who your users are and what they want, because that will make you feel more connected to the software you're building. Perhaps even more fulfilled sometimes.
I forget who it was that said there are only two businesses that have users. I think it might have been Norman from Nielsen Norman Group. Don Norman. So yeah, I prefer to call them customers.
Yeah.
I struggle even today with teams of developers in helping them realize that the customer is at the focus of everything that we do. And if you don't understand what the customer's needs are, then you just need to stop and go back to basics and go, okay, why are we doing this? What's the benefit for the customer in us doing this?
Yeah, I remember doing a Twitter thread once with various things that I find, let's say, bad or that I would improve in software development. And what was surprising to me at that point is that there was a number of things related to engineering and how I don't believe software engineering is quite at the level of engineering as it should be.
Software is not engineering, let's face it.
And so many other things. But the one that developers protested on was that software development is a profoundly humanistic activity, which I found very so this was the one that they picked. It was like the one that they had to protest about. And I can understand why, because I love technology and so on, but I love more to solve problems for people rather than...
Yeah. I think it was Dijkstra that said that computer science is not a science and it's not about computers. But the analogy that I like to use with people is that it's like a Parma ham sandwich. Computers don't create software, humans do. Computers don't use software, humans do. So the computer systems are actually like this thin layer of Parma ham in a sandwich where, like, the bread on either side is humans. Most of the sandwich is humans, right? There's very little computer there. So if it ain't about humans, what is it about?
Yeah. And with this, I think we can move to the final part of this conversation, which is about, I like to ask everybody who is on this channel about advice for junior and new programmers. So programmers who are just coming into this world, or who are, let's say, less than 3 years, 5 years into this job. And one thing that I mention is that when I first started programming, there were fundamentally two choices for me: Visual Basic or C++. But today you have Python, JavaScript, Ruby, C Sharp, Java, Node.js, Docker, all these set of things. So it's probably quite confusing for people to figure out what to do. So that's why I like to ask these questions. What advice would you give, given your experience, to new developers?
Yeah. So the problem with asking an old white guy for advice is, like, I learned programming more than 40 years ago. So, like, I saw a column a few months back, and I think it was called 8 Bits of Advice. And it was about how, if you want to learn computing, what you really need is either like a history of computing, like legacy piece of like 8-bit computing hardware, or an emulator of that running on like more commonly available hardware today. You need like some kind of computer system, like like a Sinclair Spectrum, or a Commodore um, 64, or an Amiga, or whatever. But you need like some simple kind of computer system or an emulator of it that is so simple you can actually understand everything: the RAM, the ROM, memory mapping, the way the processor works, the processor's instruction set, the program counter, the stack, the heap. You can actually understand every single bit, no pun intended. And I looked at that and I thought, that really makes sense to me, because that's how I learned. But does that really make sense anymore? Because there aren't 8-bit computers. They don't exist. And if you get an emulator, it's just some magical construct. It's a VM. I mean, why should you learn that VM rather than like the Java VM, for instance? And I thought to myself, this is the kind of article that I would write if someone said how I should learn programming now. And I would think, oh, how should people learn programming? But the reality is, I learned programming so long ago that I'm not sure I actually have anything reasonable to say about learning programming. Now, of course, that isn't going to stop me saying something. But with that in mind, caveat emptor, buyer beware. I think there's a couple of things that are worth saying. Firstly, the half-life of technology is very short. So learning anything new is probably not very valuable. This is a bit like pop music, right? There's lots of pop music that comes out every year, but very little of it actually becomes classics. Only the best of the best persists. And we look back on and say, hey, that was a great song from 2005, or whatever. Or that was a great orchestra from the 1700s. Most of the music that comes out in any period of time is rubbish. This is the old adage that 90% of everything is rubbish. Although it's probably more than 90%. So all of the new stuff that we see that comes out, most of it's going to be rubbish. If you wait 5 or 10 years, if it's still around, then yeah, it probably has some value. Then maybe it's worth learning. So I guess the thing that I would say is, as my first karate instructor said to me, kihon, 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 basics, basics, basics. Stuff like algorithms and data structures and concurrency and parallel processing paradigms, and McCarthy's original Lisp paper, and stuff that you might think isn't going to be useful because it's like stuff from 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. If people are still saying it's valuable today, and not like your peers, but people who've been in the industry for 20 plus years, if they're saying it's still valuable today, it's probably worthwhile listening to them. Those kinds of pieces of knowledge have a very long half-life. They're not just going to be valuable today, they're going to be valuable next year and next decade, and possibly even next century, although you probably won't be around to see it. You know, Newton's laws of motion are still valuable today. So I guess part of it is looking for those things, looking for the old valuable things, looking for the things that are foundational knowledge that you can build upon, and learning those. Mastering one thing. If you're starting out, learn one thing and learn it well. And it doesn't really matter what it is. You know, it could be Python. It could be, which is kind of de rigueur these days. Whatever it is, just learn one thing and learn it well. Focus on keeping things as simple as possible. Probably simpler than possible, because most of the things that you don't think are possible actually, yeah, really are. I mean, I have a unique viewpoint on this because I started as a physicist, and physicists have a different viewpoint from normal people. For a physicist, 4 forces is too many. Physicists believe that the entire universe is composed of 4 fundamental forces: the strong and the weak electromagnetic force, the nuclear force, and gravity. And yet, there are still a substantial number of physicists who say, this is too many. There must be one unifying force that, in actual fact, describes and creates all of the other forces, because 4 things is too many. So, yes, the advice I would give is make it as simple as you can. And when you can't think that you can make it any simpler, try harder or get some help. You know, ask some other people, because actually you can probably make it simpler. There is probably a simpler way that you just haven't got to yet. And I think the final thing is you mentioned the magical 5-year number, and there's this point at which it becomes legitimate to use the title senior developer. And particularly in our industry, the Stack Overflow developer survey, for instance, tells us that slightly more than 50% of developers have 5 or less years of experience. So there is like a bulging demographic in the IT industry. IT is growing, lots of new people are becoming developers. And as such, it's a very young industry, not necessarily in terms of physical age, but in terms of maturity of experience. Now, before COVID, I asked my hairdresser how long their apprenticeship was. And you know what they said?
6 months, a year.
They said 5 years.
5 years, okay.
And I said, is that normal? And they said, yes, that's completely normal for a hairdresser. So I guess the question that I would ask developers is, do you think software development is much easier than hairdressing? Do you know, if you ask people how long an apprenticeship in software engineering or software development should be, right, and they say less than 5 years, right, you're saying, oh, so it's easier than hairdressing then. Okay, fine. So I tie this back to martial arts, right? A lot of people who haven't experienced martial arts believe that a black belt is a sign of mastery. Anyone that's trained for any length of time realizes that no, a black belt is not a sign of mastery. It typically takes round about 5 years in a traditional martial art to get a black belt. And that doesn't make you a master. What that signifies is that you've passed through the door and you are now a serious student, unlike all of the others who've quit already. Mastery is still many years away. So being a developer is similar. When you've spent 5 years doing it, you are at the point, hopefully, where you are finishing your apprenticeship. You are now a jobbing developer. You're no longer a developer in training. But you're not a senior developer. Not for a long time. You've still got a lot of learning ahead of you.
Yeah, and I agree. One thing I liked about the initial manifesto for software craftsmanship, or as I call it now, software craft, to be more inclusive, was that it starts with as aspiring software crafters. And what stuck with me was always the aspiring part. I'm always aspiring to something. It's not, I don't like to be called software crafter necessarily, but I'm aspiring to that thing, whatever that is. So,
we are discovering better ways.
Yeah. Well, it's been a very interesting conversation. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience before we close?
Yes, there is one thing I would like to share. I'm going to see if I've got this. Yeah, here we go. This, I hope you can see it, is a book by Anders Ericsson called Peak. So Anders Ericsson is someone who has studied the acquisition of skills and the path to expertise, to expert performance in skills, in everything from concert pianists to ballerinas to memory experts to chess players to ice hockey players, lots and lots and lots of different things across all kinds of different fields. And he's made it his lifetime of study to try and find the kind of the secret to mastery of skills, looking to see whether there was some like special approach or methodology or genetic advantage or some common factor in achieving mastery in a skill. And he failed. There is no evidence anywhere that there is a gene that makes you a better ice hockey player, or a gene that makes you a better chess master, or a gene that makes you a better concert pianist. There have been many thousands of studies. It doesn't exist. Yes, if you want to become an Olympic weightlifter, yeah, genetics will help you there, right? But that's just like, there are tiny, tiny fraction of the total possible fields of endeavor where a genetic difference will give you an advantage. Vast majority of fields of endeavor, no. There's only one thing that makes a difference. And that's that you persist, that you do not give up, that you keep going, you keep struggling, you keep getting better, you keep on at it. It's the only thing he found that made a difference. And so that's really like the piece of advice that I would close with. It's like, occasionally we all have days, whether we're beginners or people who've been at this for many years, we have days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months even, when we just feel we're not making any progress at all, and we question whether it's worth it and why do we bother. And all I can say is that if you just don't give up, you will get there in the end.
And with that, this has been a great pleasure. Thank you a lot, Nigel. Where can people find you?
Fox, please. Sleepy Fox on Twitter, Sleepy Fox on GitHub, Sleepy Fox on Gmail, Sleepy Fox in all the places.
One last question. How come you picked Sleepy Fox as your avatar?
Oh, that's a long story. That'll over a beer sometime.
All right. So it will have
It's fairly arbitrary. Let's just leave it at that.
Okay, so it was fairly arbitrary. Thank you. Thank you, Fox. And I hope to share, to have a pint of beer with you soon after the COVID situation ends. Yeah.
When Europe has finally managed to put COVID to bed and got it all under control.
And hopefully we can travel to Britain and back. Yeah. So thank you a lot, and you've heard this conversation. I think it was very interesting. I think we've learned a lot about how to become better at what we do. That was the core of this discussion. I would like to remind you to like, subscribe, share this video. We have to pay our dues to the algorithms. And until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart.